So, welcome everybody. Welcome. Do say hello and write something in the chat. And yeah, this is my first. I did a little trial run a few days ago, but this is my first real full-length Facebook Live. So it's yeah, just bear with me while I get the hang of the technology. So welcome again. I'm just going to light this candle just to call in the energies of support. And let's just take a moment to be here, to arrive. So I'm Catherine G. Lucas. I'm the author of 4 books on helping you move successfully through crisis. I'm also the founder of the Spiritual Crisis Network, the UK charity that's been going about 15 years now. Extraordinary. And I'm a mindfulness trainer. So I've worked with Gail. Hi, welcome. And by the way, do put in the chat whereabouts you are in the world. It'd be lovely to see that, to know where people are from. So I'm also a mindfulness trainer, and I've worked with traumatized soldiers returning from war zones, amongst other groups. But yeah, that was a great privilege to work with them. So what we're going to be covering today, we're going to cover the 3 fundamental stages of moving successfully through spiritual crisis, or we can also call it spiritual emergency, psycho-spiritual crisis. All these different terms are used. And I'm going to stop and kind of make plenty of time. Rob, hi, welcome. And yeah, just I'm going to allow plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to kind of break things up into 3 segments, kind of the 3 sections that I'm covering, really. So Wolverhampton, great. And if anybody else wants to put in the chat where they're from, it'd be good to see that. Yes, so we're going to be covering the 3 fundamental stages of moving successfully through spiritual crisis. And then I'd like to cover 3 key things that will really kind of help you kind of in the process of moving successfully through. And so Snowdonia, wow, Gail's from Snowdonia, fantastic. And by the way, bear with me because I'm not, maybe it's the mindfulness kind of person in me, but I'm not that good at multitasking. So when I'm reading the screen, I can't also be talking. And yeah, and then finally, harnessing the gifts from spiritual crisis and kind of taking those back out into the world. So just to, I think, it's probably going to be helpful for me to share a little bit about my story. And some of you may know some of this already. But if I start with the kind of major kind of period of crisis that I went through in 2003 when I was 40, so a kind of interesting age, quite a kind of maybe a classic age to be going through spiritual crisis. And I actually ended up in a wheelchair for a few days. What I went through was so intense, emotionally, psychologically, that my legs gave way. And yeah, I couldn't walk. I was in Egypt at the time with a group. And I couldn't even get to the loo, my hotel room, without help. So it was quite dramatic, actually, the kind of physical impact of what I was going through emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. Now that, I mean, you know, I think it's good to contrast that with what had happened to me some 20 years earlier, when I was 20 years old, when I ended up on a psychiatric ward. I ended up on an acute ward for about a month. This was at the time when my parents' marriage kind of broke down, and I kind of broke down with it. But, you know, and I'll talk more about this later, about the kind of the difference, but I think it does put me in a unique position in terms of my expertise in this whole area of spiritual crisis. Because kind of on the one hand, I had this experience of ending up in hospital and kind of losing a year of my life. And then 20 years later, I was able to re-engage with this process in a completely different, with a completely different outcome, if you like, kind of really kind of making big changes in my life, very positive changes. So yeah, and I'll come on to that a bit more, kind of as I go through, probably. I also went through another subsequent period of crisis 3 years later, in 2006, when I was 43. And actually both times, in 2003 and 2006, it was really my mindfulness practice which I saw really helped me to watch what the mind was up to, and to kind of step back a little bit from this very intense experience, an experience that was terrifying at times and blissful at others. And that's why I then trained to become a mindfulness trainer. So there's a kind of, you know, all of this kind of slots into place and makes sense, really. It was because I saw how powerful the mindfulness was in an acute situation. So I just want to say welcome to Saskia from the Netherlands. Lovely to have you here. Okay, so let me maybe kind of dive straight into the first topic that I want to cover, which is these three fundamental stages of really any spiritual crisis. I think it's fair to say that these are true of whatever experience we're talking about, whether it's a kind of dark night of the soul, whether it's an experience that's a bit more mystical. Not that dark night of the soul isn't necessarily, but yeah, and maybe I should say a little bit about spiritual crisis and kind of how I'm using this term, because there are kind of elements to spiritual crisis which kind of define it, really. So one is definitely the intensity of it, because if we think of this as a process of awakening, of a kind of wake-up call, that something needs our attention, something needs healing, something wants to emerge in us. So, which is where we get this term spiritual emergence and emergency, you know, the kind of play on words, really. So if we think of it as a crisis of awakening, what happens really is that it kind of speeds up and intensifies. And this is what makes it so tricky to cope with, and can really leave us overwhelmed and create an absolute roller coaster of emotions. So, and of course, you know, we also can get into the whole very complex area of the relationship between mental health and spiritual crisis. And, you know, I personally don't feel it's that helpful necessarily to think of either or. You know, there's a kind of a spectrum, and often, you know, if I think of my own experiences when I was 20, before I ended up in hospital, you know, I experienced what I now know can be called unitive states of consciousness, where you have this sense of connectedness with everything, this oneness of all things, all beings, unbounded love, this kind of unconditional love. And yet, at the same time, there can be elements that are definitely kind of our wounding and our trauma coming up to the surface, our shadow material coming to the surface. So it's a very complex area, actually. This is certainly, I don't want to, in a sense, I kind of created this kind of framework for today of, 3 clear stages of moving through, but they're not necessarily easy steps or easy stages. It's a very complex process. So in terms of, sorry, I've got some water here. Excuse me a moment. So if we look at the first key phase, the key stage of moving successfully through these extraordinary experiences, the first is really getting through the worst of the crisis. Now, the crisis might be relatively short-lived. It might be, when I was in Egypt, when I ended up in a wheelchair, it was really the worst of the crisis. The most intense was only a week. Whereas a few years later, I would say that the most intense period lasted a whole month. It was, it was pretty full on. So it can be hours, days, weeks, but our priority is to just get through the worst of the crisis and stay safe. So that's the first stage, and there's a lot that I could say about that, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about that today. We can come back to that another time if that's of interest. So that's the first key stage. And then the second, once we've got through the worst of it and we've kind of landed a little bit, hopefully, is then kind of starting to make sense of what we've been through, starting to integrate and understand all of this. And, that in itself can be a very long process, that can take years. And we need, I'll talk a little bit later about kind of the different things that we need at the different stages. But certainly, we need help, usually in kind of making sense of it and understanding it and unpacking it all. And I don't want to give you the impression, as I talk about these 3 stages, it's because it makes it easier to present, but I don't want to give you the impression that it's a linear process, that we move, from 1 to 2 to 3. It's we can move in and out of these stages. They can overlap, and so it's not a linear process. And then the third key stage is, and I guess this really also, this is maybe where we're going to get the overlap between the second and the third and kind of moving in and out. The third key stage is kind of harnessing the gifts and going back out, taking those back out into the world. And that's, that's a process in itself. And that can also take some time, because we're probably going to need to make some major readjustments in our life. These are profound experiences. They're huge and deeply significant. And if we're going to really honor them and do them justice, then we certainly can't, kind of try and turn the clock back and just go back to life as it was before. We're probably going to want to rethink certain things. And that might be in terms of relationships, it might be in terms of our working life, it might be in terms of where we live. You know, these are kind of maybe the three major areas. And in fact, actually, over a period of 2 or 3 years, I actually ended up making massive changes in all of those areas. In terms of, well, in some respects, the kind of the end of my first marriage was the beginning of a process. But then, you know, I ended up leaving a career as a university lecturer behind, moving into this whole field of personal and spiritual development, and giving up a 9-to-5 job because I just could no longer work in a 9-to-5 context. And also wanted to really be able to integrate the spiritual part of me and of my life into my work. So you know, fairly major changes. And actually, you know, sometimes that in itself can be fairly traumatic, especially if it's forced upon us. Sometimes it's kind of almost as if the universe kind of strips everything away from us, and leaves us with no choice to kind of completely rethink our lives, really, but from a different perspective, from a more expanded, heightened awareness. So it's a very beautiful process, even though it's, you know, it can be pretty challenging. But I haven't come across anybody who, having kind of come through, has any regrets whatsoever. You know, there's the sense that this is a blessing, and part of our challenge, I think, is to see it as a blessing even when we're in the midst of it, and that, you know, that really is a challenge, you know. So those are the kind of 3 key stages: staying safe and getting through the worst, getting over the worst of the crisis, making sense of it and integrating it, and using the hero's journey. The hero's journey is a really helpful model for doing that. And then finally, kind of harnessing the gifts and taking those kind of back out into the world. And that doesn't necessarily mean taking those gifts out into the world in a public way. It's just kind of back out into your world, your everyday life. Yeah. Okay, so I would like to just pause there for a moment, and we also, sorry, I'm just scrolling down to see who else has joined. So welcome, Annabelle. Lovely to have you here, and yeah, I feel your support. And Andrea as well, from Tuscany in Italy. Wonderful, where I spent part of my childhood. So, benvenuto, Andrea. Good. So now Saskia says she's finding my book helpful through 2013, 2014. Great. So I'm going to pause now just to take any questions that you might have about that kind of the first kind of segment, about these kind of 3 key phases or stages, remembering that it's not a linear process and they can kind of overlap. So has anybody got anything that you'd like to ask about that before I move on? Okay, so that sounds like it's all pretty clear then. Okay. Maybe, you know, if you would like to share, actually this could be a good opportunity for you to share if you want to, and if you feel comfortable to do that, what, if any of that resonates with you, you know, in terms of what stage, you know, where you feel you're at now. You know, I sometimes, you know, sometimes I kind of move back into that second stage of making sense of integrating it. Even last summer, I went through a period of kind of suddenly getting more insight into the kind of visionary material that came through when I was in crisis. And, you know, that's, how many years later is that? Oh my goodness, it's like 14 years later, still kind of processing and integrating, and still kind of working out new directions in my work and taking it back out into the world. So it's very much an ongoing process, and a lifetime's journey, really. Okay, good. So let me move on then, and I think I may end up, as I move on to the kind of second segment, if you like, I may end up kind of cycling back a little bit of things that I maybe didn't say first time round that kind of feel relevant to touch on. So in terms of the second segment, which is the key 3 things to help you move successfully through. Now, you know, you may have heard kind of estate agents talk about location, location, location. And in spiritual crisis, it's really support, support, support. It's just so fundamental. And of course, the challenge is, you know, can be reaching out for that support, and knowing how to do that, being able to allow that in. And I think, you know, there are so many different types of support that we can need. So, and of course, this is one of the reasons I forgot to mention, actually, one of the reasons why it's so helpful to get a sense of roughly what stage we're in of these 3 key stages that I've been talking about, is because we need different things at the different stages. And particularly, you know, in terms of support, we need very different support at the different stages. So, you know, in terms of coping with the worst of the crisis, we may need support with basics like maybe food shopping, or somebody to cook meals or help us cook meals. Somebody maybe who can take us out for a walk if we don't feel able to go out on our own. So you know, that's kind of one level of support that is a very kind of nitty-gritty kind of day-to-day, and yet really essential kind of support. But equally in that phase of kind of coping with the worst of the crisis, there's also, you know, obviously the emotional support of friends and family who can kind of lend a listening ear. And there's also the professional support, whether that's mainstream medical support, GP, psychiatrists, or whether it's counsellors, psychotherapists. And I would say, you know, I think sometimes people have a sense that actually you can't really work with a psychotherapist when you're in the depths of kind of like the worst of the crisis. And I think, you know, my experience of that is that we can work very differently at that point. So if I think back to my therapist and how he and I worked together when I was actually in the midst of the crisis, and we basically went out into the garden, and we focused very much on grounding, on sitting on the ground, the grass, working with the trees and the energy of the trees, the rootedness of the trees. So the focus was very much on what I needed in that moment, which was support and help with the grounding. And then, you know, as I moved through, we then kind of worked more on kind of making sense of it, integrating it, understanding it. And then, you know, so, and even that process is very different from what a typical traditional, well, if there is such a thing as a typical therapy session, but certainly, you know, I think we can work therapeutically at that stage of the height of the crisis, but the emphasis needs to be very different. So the other types of support that we need, and this is maybe not so much in the kind of height of the crisis, maybe it's more kind of once we're kind of moving out of that, but we probably could benefit from a whole range of support from various different holistic practitioners. Now, you know, depending on what it is, you know, what particular flavor our crisis has taken. So it could be that we need, let me see, it could be homeopathy, can be very helpful. It might be if we're having Kundalini issues, kind of a lot of energy kind of issues and kind of chakras blasted open, things like that, then we might want to seek support from somebody who has kind of Kundalini expertise. Or if there's past life material that's been coming up, then we might well want to seek help from somebody who has that kind of expertise. Or in terms of any kind of entities or kind of attachments, any kind of dark energies that we might feel around, then we might want some help from spirit release. So there's a whole range. And, you know, in my experience, you know, supporting so many people over so many years, you know, often we need a combination of different things. So it's not like, you know, just kind of necessarily one thing. It could be two or three. It's kind of like maybe a team of support, maybe different modalities, and maybe different modalities at different times. Certainly the first thing, you know, when I'm supporting somebody, working with somebody, the first thing we look at is what support do they already have in place and what other support do they need, and kind of identifying the different modalities and how to find the right person, whether that's locally or online. Because nowadays so much work can be done remotely. It's fantastic because, you know, there aren't always the experts in our physical geographical location that we need. Good. So that's a little bit about support, the different types of support, and kind of maybe some of the different things that we need at different times. I maybe should also mention peer support. You know, the Spiritual Crisis Network, that's very much peer support that the network offers, which is invaluable, absolutely invaluable, really. There's one qualifier that I really want to add here when we're talking about support, which is that the support and then the support. And what I mean by that is when I was 20 and I mentioned that I ended up in a psychiatric hospital, it's not that I didn't have support. I did have support around me, but there was nobody within that support network who had an understanding of this process of spiritual emergence and emergency. There was nobody who had that kind of frame of reference. There was nobody who could see this as potentially a positive experience, that, you know, that there was some healing to be done, there was some growth, something that wanted to emerge. Whereas 20 years later, what made the huge difference was that I did have that kind of support. I had support. I had a therapist who had personal experience of spiritual crisis. I had the whole team. At the time I was doing some psychotherapy training, so I had the kind of you know, it's very much group work. So I had the whole group and the training staff, and they were absolutely fantastic. This is the Karuna Institute in Devon, Core Process Psychotherapy. And I had a very close friend who was with me in Egypt, who also had this kind of spiritual frame of reference. So people who were familiar with the work of Stanislav Grof, and you may well have heard of Stanislav Grof. He and his wife Christina actually coined this term, spiritual emergency. So that really, you know, that's one of the things, because I think I mentioned, I think earlier, that it kind of puts me in a unique position, that I had this one experience where, in a sense, I kind of floundered really when I was 20. And then 20 years later, I was able to re-engage with this kind of process, this kind of what John Weir Perry calls a natural process of renewal. I was able to re-engage with it. So rather than floundering, I was able to flourish. And there are certain key things that kind of make the difference. And one of them is the support. And the key word here really is validation. It's having a support that is validating rather than pathologizing. So we need to be quite discerning, I think. You know, we need to find health professionals, whether that's holistic, integrative health professionals, or whether it's mainstream health professionals, but we really ideally want to find ones that have a transpersonal approach, a transpersonal perspective. And transpersonal, to some extent, you know, we're kind of using this term as a synonym for spiritual, that have this kind of bigger, broader, deeper perspective. So let me just think back a second, recap how we're doing here. So that's, yeah, in terms of the three key things that you need to help you move successfully through, I would say that the fundamental one is support. And ideally validating support. Now I've sort of touched a little bit on the second thing that I feel we need, which is this transpersonal frame of reference, this kind of spiritual perspective. Because when I was 20, I had absolutely no, I'm not sure I'd even heard the word spiritual. I came from such a secular family and had had such a secular upbringing that there was absolutely nothing in my frame of reference that could give me this kind of perspective. And yet, you know, 20 years later, by then, after the breakdown of my first marriage, I'd learned to meditate, because I was really struggling with huge stress and just the emotional, psychological impact. And I had a full-time lectureship and a very difficult working relationship with my head of department. And so I learned to meditate. And that kind of changed my life. Actually, I think meditation classes should come with a kind of warning. But it was, you know, so that was the beginning of me kind of entering more consciously onto my spiritual journey. So that by the time I was in Egypt, and by the time I ended up in this wheelchair, I had, you know, learned a huge amount and kind of really, had a very different perspective on life. I was working with a spiritual teacher, which is why the group of us were in Egypt. It was very much a spiritual trip of kind of inner and outer exploration. So that, I would say, is the second key thing that is really very helpful, is having one's own spiritual frame of reference. Just as to kind of get a perspective, get a bigger perspective, to be able to see that there's some positives in this. And then the third thing and this probably won't surprise you, given what I said in the introduction, and maybe for those of you who joined a little bit late, maybe I'll just add, in the introduction I was sharing that I'm a mindfulness teacher, and that I trained to become a mindfulness teacher because I saw, when I was in crisis in Egypt, and subsequently 3 years later, I saw how helpful my mindfulness practice was. So the third key thing that I personally really recommend is mindfulness. And in a sense, when I'm, what we're talking about is awareness. But I do think that specific mindfulness practices and training can really help us to kind of train that awareness muscle, to kind of become much more self-aware in terms of our emotions, our thinking, our physical bodily sensations, just to kind of really bring us into the present moment. And mindfulness can not only help us during the worst of the crisis to be able to step back a little bit and watch the antics of the mind. I mean, particularly in Egypt, what I saw was that the more my fear levels escalated, the more my kind of rational mind struggled to make sense of what was going on, and my left brain struggled, and I tipped over into thinking that was kind of maybe a bit distorted. Maybe, just the left brain, the logical left brain, desperately trying to make sense of things that cannot be understood by the left brain. Because, these experiences, these kind of more mystical, unitive states of consciousness, it's very difficult for the left brain to make sense of them. So if we're operating from the left brain, we're going to get into trouble, really. And it reminds me of what Carl Jung said. His red book is very much the record of his period of spiritual crisis. And he said that for 3 years, he actually couldn't read a scientific book, a kind of left brain, analytical kind of, just kind of textbook or anything like that, because for that whole period he was so immersed in the right brain and these kind of states, these states of consciousness that are not kind of everyday states of consciousness. So so mindfulness, and so I was saying mindfulness can help us during the worst of the crisis, but I think in particular it can be really helpful, for those of us that have maybe had more than one period of crisis, and actually that's very, very common. Kyla Nightingale in her research discovered this, that people typically will have 2, 3, 4, several multiple periods of crisis. And that's where I feel the mindfulness can really come into its own. Because if we learn those skills and tools at a time when things are kind of relatively settled, then if we start to move into a heightened state that becomes a little bit tricky to manage, then we've got the mindfulness practice to fall back on. So I'm seeing, now this is very interesting, maybe somebody can enlighten me here. I'm seeing lots of sort of things floating up the screen, the side of a screen, that look like that's kind of really resonating with people. It looks like kind of thumbs up or something, or I am such a novice at this Facebook Live stuff. But so I have a sense that that's kind of resonating, and I saw them earlier as well, and I wasn't quite sure what was going on. Great, thank you. Well, this is fun, we should do this more often, although it does feel like a little bit of a monologue. So yeah, so those are the three key things that are going to help us move successfully through this. The support, and ideally validating support, then the transpersonal spiritual frame of reference, this kind of sense that good can come from this, however challenging, however tough, and believe me, I know how horrendous it can be because I've been there more than once. But yeah, this kind of spiritual frame of reference, and then thirdly, the mindfulness. So now I would at this point like to stop. I need to kind of check how I'm doing for time as well, and really would like to take your questions at this point. I'm sure you must have something coming up. So I should scroll up and see. Right. Okay. So I'm just yeah, so Saskia says yes, it sometimes comes back through the years. Yeah, and kind of the next layer of it, I guess, Saskia, the next layer of learning, maybe, or the next layer of healing or of growth. Yeah, and the grounding, I think the grounding and the mindfulness can be so helpful when that happens. So Rob says, I've been through all three stages. Stage one, yeah, I mean, that's, so you kind of feel like you've come out. Hang on, let me read it first and then I'll see what you're saying, Rob. Stage one felt like the storm. Yeah. Stage two was the clearing up after the storm. And stage three was rebuilding and starting anew, feeling reborn. Yeah. Fantastic. I like the analogy. Yeah. 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 And it's an ongoing process. It really is. So John's in London. Welcome, John. Good to have you here. And Helly's here as well. Fantastic. And Helly's asking, is this going to be on YouTube? That's a very good question. I will certainly do my best to see if I can download it and from Facebook and upload it to YouTube. It's a very good idea. Thank you for that, Helly. And Saskia says, I didn't have support for most of the time. Yeah, that can be really hard, Saskia. And I think we can feel so isolated and so alone with this. One of the reasons that I felt kind of really drawn and inspired to kind of setting up the Spiritual Crisis Network was because I'm trying to remember now, it's such a long time ago, but I think I had a sense that, we really needed more support, more information, that there was just so little to be found. And of course that was 15 years ago now. A lot has changed in 15 years. So Sassia's saying only books like mine. Had to eat differently for some time. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't do yoga. Yeah, that makes sense. And in fact, actually, Saskia, that's a really good point, because, one of the things we need to do is to kind of pull back on our spiritual practice a little bit. If it's a spiritual practice, if it's a spiritual practice that can actually help us to get more grounded, I know some people can actually do that. I think it depends just how blasted open we are, how far wide open the crown chakra is blasted, really. But certainly, in terms of the mindfulness, something like walking meditation can be good, can be grounding, but certainly traditional sitting meditation is maybe, just not helpful and not recommended. And it sounds like for you, it was good to kind of hold off the yoga for a while. And eating differently, eating lighter. And that's interesting, because I think also some people find they actually have to eat kind of maybe a bit heavier in terms of, trying to kind of get a bit more grounded, in terms of, maybe somebody who doesn't normally eat meat, just kind of maybe doing that. But it also makes total sense to me that you would need to eat lighter, because you'd be feeling so sensitive to the energies of everything, including food. Gail says we're joined by a nice fire. Do you know, not quite sure what Gail means by that, whether she's got her fire lit at home. That was lovely. I'll be talking about fire, actually. I'm going to do an Easter special in a few weeks' time. I'm going to do another one of these, talking about the significance of Easter, and I'm going to talk about fire and Kundalini, and also Notre Dame, which was Easter time. It's coming up for a year nearly. So yeah. Rob says, during my awakening, I had breakfast outside with my bare feet on the roots of a willow tree. That sounds like such a good grounding practice. Sounds like the kind of thing that my therapist helped me to do. Fantastic. It really helped me to ground. Yeah. Beautiful tree. At the moment, I'm just kind of developing this lovely relationship with a tree near where I live, and just having kind of almost, well, not every day, but several times a week, going and seeing her or him, having a little chat. It's beautiful. Oh, yes, I finally found an energy therapist. Right, okay. Yeah, great. But it can take a while to find the right person. And actually, that's one of the things that I do when I'm working with people, supporting people with clients, is kind of, helping them to find the right person, as well as, my support. And sometimes, sometimes I'm not the best person, the right person, and I help people find who would be. So Saskia says, I was so afraid then that I would, right, yeah. And I think that's the fear, Saskia. It's, we're kind of treading such a fine line sometimes. Yeah. That's so interesting, isn't it? Sorry, I'm kind of reading. I don't know whether you've all been able to read what Saskia's saying here. That in terms of Kundalini, she could only find people who are familiar with the good side of it. And I think that's a little bit of a danger sometimes with Kundalini yoga teachers. If they haven't experienced some of this, they're kind of really gung-ho about how fantastic Kundalini yoga is, and I appreciate that Kundalini yoga has a huge amount to offer, but there is a much more challenging aspect to when Kundalini gets spontaneously awoken, in a way that it isn't held, or that our Kundalini yoga teacher doesn't have experience of, then that's going to be really quite tricky. And of course, luckily we've got people like Bonnie Greenwell. But of course, how would you know? I mean, even I suppose nowadays it's easier to search things on the internet than it was 15 years ago, 20 years ago. There's so much more there. But if you'd never heard of Kundalini, you wouldn't even know that what you're experiencing is Kundalini. And I'm thinking now in terms of the kind of like the vibrations that you can get in your body, or the kind of kriyas, these kind of spontaneous movements where you can find your body going into yoga positions or mudras, the hand positions. You might have you wouldn't be able to Google Kundalini because you wouldn't even know it was called Kundalini. And that's, I think, partly what the Spiritual Crisis Network, and the email support, because the Spiritual Crisis Network at the moment offers email support, but that's the kind of information that can be available there. So Saskia, I feel for you, because it's a hard place to be when we feel so alone with it and so isolated. Yeah, but great that you kind of moved beyond that now. Rob says it will automatically appear on my, yes, it'll appear on the Facebook page. Thanks, Rob. But then it's kind of getting it onto YouTube. There's a whole other ball game, but I'll get there. Julie says internal fire. Question mark. Transformational fire. Yeah. The fire of transformation. And as I say, I'll talk more about that when I do the Easter special in a few weeks' time. Good. Okay. So, how are we doing for time? Great. It's about 10 to. I'm sorry, by the way, that I haven't had any slides for you. I kind of suddenly realised rather late in the day that it might have been a good idea to have some PowerPoint slides. But it just hadn't occurred to me beforehand. Again, just shows how new I am to this whole Facebook Live thing. So yeah, so thanks for bearing with me, and yeah. So finally then, in terms of harnessing the gifts of spiritual crisis, I think, if we've moved through these key stages, then and especially, I think, especially if we've worked in that second stage of kind of integrating, maybe using the hero's journey, especially if we've been feeling a bit stuck. I certainly found the hero's journey really helpful for getting unstuck. So yeah, if we've moved through these kind of stages, and if we've kind of worked out what changes we need to make in our life, in terms of, like I mentioned before, work, or maybe maybe we actually feel a new calling after going through all of this, to train in a new holistic therapy, for example, or just to move in a different direction with our work. So in a sense, as we move through these key 3 stages, that is already us harnessing the gifts, if you like. And sometimes I think it's only kind of in hindsight that we look back and we can see exactly what those gifts were, and it's going to be very different for each and every one of us. It's a very individual thing. I mean, certainly if we think in terms of the hero's journey, if we think of the Elixir, which is the kind of the gift of what we've been through, that we're harnessing, what that looks like is very different for each and every one of us. So just I think reflecting back, looking back, I mean, when I look back now at what I've harnessed from this, it's extraordinary, really, over the last 15 years. And it's ongoing, and I would say that really working with the hero's journey was fundamental in helping me to unlock some of that. I think at one point I'd got quite stuck, and actually had a wonderful experience up in the woods near where I was living then, where our local Spiritual Crisis Network group in Stroud, we put together this beautiful ritual and ceremony that kind of really helped me to kind of own the gifts and integrate them. And so this is something that I would really recommend in terms of how to harness the gifts, is kind of, maybe think about creating some kind of ritual, some kind of ceremony, so that you can kind of really kind of acknowledge and own and okay, so these are the gifts, and this is what I want to take back into my everyday life, what I want to take out into the world. So yeah, I think maybe I'll leave it at that, because I just want to got a few things. That somebody sent me a question beforehand. I'm not sure if she's actually with us here live, actually, but let me answer her question. She was asking about how can we let go of things that stay with us for a very long time, that we find really difficult to kind of let go of and kind of process. And I would say that this is where support comes in, because some kinds of trauma we really do need extra help with. And and I use the word trauma, when we are so sensitive, and most of us who go through these experiences, if we weren't HSPs, highly sensitive person beforehand, then by the time we've come through this process, we're certainly probably going to be much more sensitive than we were, kind of heightened sensitivity. And so even relatively small things can be quite traumatic. And I think, you know, this is where a counsellor or psychotherapist can be really helpful to process that. Sometimes we need more than just what we can do ourselves with our journaling, with our accepting. You know, I think an extra little bit of support can go a long way. Just to wrap up, has anybody got any questions before I kind of just want to let you know I've got some goodies to tell you about, some freebies to tell you about. So stay tuned for a couple minutes more. But has anybody got any questions? Just before I share. Okay, great. So let me just say. So as I mentioned, I'm going to do another one of these in a few weeks' time. So if you're not on my mailing list, then do get onto my mailing list. catherineglucas.com. You can sign up there, and then you'll get notification of the Easter special that I'm going to be doing. And also, if you're not on my mailing list, when you sign up, you'll automatically get taken through to a link to book in a free 45-minute consultation with me. So, you know, you're very welcome to do that. You know, we can have a chat, see where you're at in the process, and yeah, what you need. And so yeah, so that's, if you are already on my mailing list, you can go to, on my website, go to the support page, and you'll find under mindfulness mentoring, you can find there, you can book a free 45-minute session with me. We can either, you know, that can be for, it doesn't have to be mindfulness mentoring, it might be just wherever you're at in your journey of a spiritual crisis that you want to have a chat about. So that's my offering to you, for you, which I'm very, very pleased to be able to share with you. And if you're in the Cheltenham area, or anywhere in the west of England, or whether you want to travel a little bit further to come and see me, I'm giving a talk at the Isbourne on Monday the 6th of April. It's an evening talk, and we'll also have a book signing of my latest book, Life Crisis. We'll have refreshments and book signing, so it'll be fun. And the title of my talk then is Crisis as Catalyst for Personal and Planetary Awakening. So I'll be touching on the more global dimension, more global perspective as well. And in fact, I'll be doing that when I do my Easter special. I want to touch on slightly bigger themes, slightly more global international themes too. So I look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thank you very, very much for being here today, everybody. It's been great. I've really appreciated your comments, and yeah, look forward to more. It's been a really positive experience for me, this first one. So I really appreciate your support. Thanks very much. Bye for now.